Back in 2017, I did a somewhat brief and spoiler-free review of My Little Pony the movie. I didn't go into more detail at the time because I knew that the movie was still in theaters and I didn't want to go into any spoilers. But now that it's out on DVD and Blu-ray, I think I can do a more unrestricted review of one of the more topical movies that came out in 2017. I've watched the MLP movie several more times since its first release, and with those additional viewings, I think I've come up with more things to say about the film. So sit back, relax, and prepare yourself, because this is My Little Pony the Movie, Revisited. Initially, I was going to talk about the supplementary material and all of the side stuff that would tie into the movie. You know, the prequel book and the prequel comics and the concept art book that adds more insight on the story and characters. But somebody already beat me to that, and there's really no way I can talk about them without sounding like I'm just copying everything he's saying. So I've decided to solely focus on the movie and judge it on its own merits. And on its own, it serves as an enjoyable experience for the fans. On the other hand, it's somewhat of a basic and occasionally mediocre story, but we'll get to that later. I should start by talking about how the movie portrays the main six, as well as Spike. The way that they're written here feels like the movie is trying to introduce them to newcomers. And while that isn't a bad idea, there are a couple of times that the main group feels like they're not being given their best work. Everyone has already talked about Applejack and Fluttershy getting the shaft, and they don't really do anything significant to contribute to the story. They end up feeling like background characters despite being treated into a main role, which makes it look pointless for them to be there. The other characters are given more time and dialogue to work with, but it's not always the best. A couple of times their personalities get exaggerated to a level of annoyance, and it makes the writing feel very out of touch with the show. Understandable, since the movie was done by Megan McCarthy, who hasn't really worked on the show since the end of season 4. Rainbow Dash's ego ends up taking over other aspects of her personality, which results in her making stupid decisions that makes things difficult for the others. And Pinkie Pie is really too crazy for her own good in some scenes. She comes across as too playful and absent-minded, which puts herself in danger and blows the cover of the group when they're trying to keep a low profile. The main problem with the group, except for Twilight, is that they don't seem to be taking this mission to save Equestria very seriously. But why wouldn't they be taking it seriously? Their friends and family are being held prisoner by the Storm King, and they don't really show any sense of urgency to getting back to them. It makes them look dumb with very poor priorities. But despite that, I can't really say that the characterization is all bad. There's actually a lot of fitting dialogue and characterization seen from them in the movie. Fluttershy is calm and collective, but she doesn't show any signs of social anxiety or timid speaking patterns, which actually makes her less of a burden than Dash or Pinkie. She does contribute to the team near the end by actually taking the time to listen to one of the Storm Guards instead of attacking them, which fits her desire to help others and understand them better. She does show signs of fear and hesitation, but it's made understandable since the story takes her to an environment that she's completely unfamiliar with. She doesn't know what to expect from these places or how she'd be able to fit in them. There was never a moment in the movie where she came across as grating or a burden to the others, which is a very good thing. It really helps to show how much her character has evolved and changed since the first 2 seasons, where her cowardice and antisocial fears ended up slowing everyone down. And some of the same can actually be said about Applejack. Her straightforward persona is portrayed faithfully in the movie, and she does get some pretty good dialogue when given the chance. She's actually the one who acknowledges that they have friends and family that need rescuing while visiting Sequestria, and she's the first to suggest that they talk to Twilight, highlighting how the group just needed time to cool down after their argument. And she also has some pretty funny, straightforward facial reactions to all of the ridiculous stuff that she comes across. Everyone says that these two didn't contribute anything to the story, but I think it undermines some of the genuine entertainment that they brought to their minimal screen time. I do think they should have gotten more, but they did something nice every once in a while, so I take that for what it's worth, even if it isn't a lot. There's also Rarity, who despite her occasionally forced dialogue is still portrayed in a way that's recognizable for fans of the series. She's supportive, graceful, humorously dramatic, and is given excellent voice work by Tabitha St. Germain. Her interactions with the group as well as Capper make for some nicely worded conversations and even some very funny lines. And Rainbow Dash is honestly my least favorite portrayed of the main cast in the movie. Nothing about her character except her ego and competitive spirit spirit is ever really expressed in the movie. The most that we get from her is that she sings a song to encourage a group of pirates, which just sounds like a very bad idea. I mean, you're encouraging pirates, people who are known for robbing, pillaging, killing, and defying the law. I know you need to gain their trust to get them to take you to Mount Eris, but you have to think about the consequences on some level. They had to have a history of crime before the events of the movie, so isn't it a bit of a stretch that they're openly invited to the rest of the Friendship Festival? It just feels really confusing. Spike once again acts as a really good foil to the others, and he also has really good moments of sarcasm. He acts as Twilight's conscience, teams up with the new characters surprisingly well, and even has some very humorous dialogue. But my favorite of the group in the movie is both Twilight and Pinkie, for how excellently that they're characterized in this story. Pinkie Pie is an amazing high point in the movie, at least when she's not being an absent-minded child. A lot of her jokes are very well timed, and her bubbly, optimistic personality is very well tuned, helping her to stand out from the rest of the group. The way she relates to Skystar and bonds with her is both fitting and pretty adorable considering their common interests and personality traits. The most important aspect regarding Pinkie in this movie is how her jokes are used. Instead of just coming across as random filler to market her bubbly attitude to the audience, the jokes that she provides actually tie into the story. She interacts with the world around her, adding a sense of communication to her jokes, giving them more purpose. In fact, her party cannon from the beginning of the movie is actually used as an important plot point during the climax, so it has a reason for being in the movie besides just firing a giant cake on top of Twilight. Then you have Twilight, who makes for a very good leading role in the story. Her character is portrayed properly with her insecure obsessive-compulsive breakdowns, voice of reason attitude, very smart strategic mindset, and her dedication to finishing her task. I really admire how out of all of the characters, she's the one who seems to take the mission the most seriously, considering her responsibilities as one of the Alicorn princesses, as well as her established leadership amongst the group in the TV series. She impressively adapts to these new settings and makes great use of her surroundings. That scene where she takes the falling cargo and puts it together to make an air balloon and then uses Spike's dragon breath to make the hot air really shows that she can think things through in a dire situation. The opening scene in particular actually does a pretty good job introducing the main group to a new audience as well as letting them warm up to fans of the show. It puts time into showing their individual mannerisms, how they interact with each other, their personalities, and their roles in setting up the festival, which are key to showing their interests. I especially love how they use Applejack's background as a means to poke fun at her, encouraging Dash's playful banter with her, which is an important part of their friendship in the show. As someone who's been watching the show for years, they all behaved and interacted in a way that I recognize, which is actually impressive for Megan McCarthy since she was only loosely involved with the show while she was working on the movie. One scene that really seems to show the detail in the dynamic of their friendship is the one where Twilight tries to steal the Hippogriff Stone. Twilight tries to use Pinkie and the others to distract Queen Novo so she can try to take their pearl, an artifact that can potentially turn them into creatures that can fight off the Storm King. This understandably results in Novo banishing them, and the others get mad at Twilight for using them. One thing to consider here is that Twilight Sparkle, the Princess of Friendship, just used friendship in order to deceive others. That's actually pretty dark for her character, and it was a bad decision for her to make. But because of the way the story was played out up to that point, Twilight's decision is made to be understandable. When you look at her position throughout the movie, you realize that she was treating the situation with the severity that it needed to be treated with. The other princesses were turned to stone, their friends and family have been captured, and a power-hungry overlord is trying to dominate their homeland. Then, Pinkie Pie and Rainbow Dash ended up doing something to make the situation more difficult. Pinkie Pie blew their cover in the Sand Village, and Dash's Sonic Rain Boom was like a giant "We're over here" sign for Tempest to find. Then when Twilight tries explaining the situation to Queen Novo, she declines giving them the pearl because she couldn't risk its power falling into the Storm King's hands. From Twilight's perspective, she was the only one who was really thinking about saving Equestria in a dark hour. Twilight trying to take the pearl isn't bad characterization or a problem with the storytelling. Because of everything that happened up to that point, it comes across as an honest mistake that she made in a pressuring situation. This results in Pinkie speaking against Twilight's bad decision and and the level of sincerity that she brings to this is very appropriate, showing how serious that she can get despite her silly attitude. And while Twilight does bring up good points on her position, Pinkie does a pretty good job counter-arguing her. By using friendship to deceive others, Twilight was being no different than Tempest or the Storm King. She failed to notice the good that came with everyone's company, and it made her disillusioned about the situation. Pinkie, as well as the others, are rightfully disappointed in her. She lost sight of her own element, putting her on a path that led her to using her friends. You can tell that the sense of betrayal that Pinkie and the others are feeling is genuine, and when Twilight blows up in her face, it's a real heartbreaker. That look on Pinkie's face pretty much says it all. And in that moment, Twilight stuns herself in shock. She realizes what she just did and can't believe what she just said any more than the others. Pinkie walks away devastated by Twilight's choice of words, and she tries apologizing for it. But despite that, Pinkie just can't bring herself to talk to her. She knows Twilight didn't mean it, but she needs time to recover from the shock. Then the other girls join Pinkie, leaving Twilight alone to think about what she did, as they all need time to absorb the situation that they find themselves in. And when they find out that Twilight has been kidnapped, they start to feel guilty about leaving her in a vulnerable position. This is some really heavy stuff for a My Little Pony movie, and what makes it feel deserved is how the events of the story are implemented into the characters and how it's affecting them. Twilight was just trying to save her home, and all of the constant interferences left her feeling frustrated and alone. And the rest of the main group were really trying to give Twilight the support she needed. They just weren't as stressed out or worried as her, which allowed them to act more clear-headed. So realizing that Twilight tries to use them after all the support that they gave her makes them feel like they were just tools for her to use. Both sides of the argument are made out to be understandable, and neither side was fully in the right. Both sides were making bad decisions on this adventure and weren't putting their best faith in one another. But when the gang comes to rescue Twilight later, they do make up and realize that the flaw in their group was that they weren't fully cooperating with each other. But despite that, they never forgot about their friendship and how much it truly means to them, not even for an instant. They know that it's not perfect, but it's always going to be invaluable and indispensable to them. I really love how the dynamic of their friendship was portrayed here. It makes for some of the absolute best writing in the movie. One thing that people really like to discuss is the new characters, who are all voiced by familiar big-name actors. Some of them were really good, others not so much. I guess I could start with Capper, who seems to be a fan favorite with everyone who's seen the movie. While seeing a sentient anthro cat makes me question how exactly the sentient intelligence in this world works, I still think that Capper is a pretty fun character. He has this really sly and slippery presence to him that really makes him stand out amongst the other celebrity characters. He's really cunning in the way he takes advantage of the pony's naivete, and what makes it so convincing is the posture and his charisma. Even the tone of his voice is so deep and sneaky. It really blends in with his introduction, where you can tell that something just doesn't feel right about him, but you don't care because of how collected and charming he acts towards the main group. He's also fairly sympathetic in that you can tell that he has a pretty rough background, even without the context of the prequel content. Because he's in debt to someone, it's likely that he's in a impoverished environment and he had to grow up in that tough social circle. He's just doing what he has to survive, and he had to do it by himself since no one else had offered to help him. This is why he acts surprised and suspicious when Rarity offers to fix his clothes, and he feels a sense of relief that someone was actually thinking of him in a way that was hospitable. And because of her generosity, he has second thoughts about the ponies and decides to help them out. It's actually pretty impressive how his character managed to develop with such a small amount of screen time, and he has really good chemistry with the other characters too. That look on his face when he uses Spike as a flamethrower is so devilish but also so enthusiastic. I really love what they did with this guy, and I'm really looking forward to seeing him again if they make another movie, and if they can afford to hire Tag Diggs. I swear Dig manages to add so much personality to Capper because of how well his voice fits with his personality and design, and I really can't think of anyone else who could have done a better job voicing him. Next you have the Parrot Pirates led by Captain Solano, and I have to be honest, they're kind of forgettable. I don't remember too much about them, and they don't really do anything significant that would contribute to their personalities. I guess they were courageous pirates before the Storm King stripped them of their dignity and Rainbow Dash helped them get it back, but they don't do anything that's nearly as entertaining or impressionable as Capper. I will admit though that the the designs of the pirates themselves are actually pretty creative. I love this attention to detail. Considering that they're pirates, you'd expect them to have the typical missing body parts. But what really sells it is how distinct and different they look from each other. One of them is missing an eye, one of them is missing a leg, one of them is missing a tail, and so on. They also give the pirates a different figure as to make them stand out from each other a lot more. And the different blends of colors of their feathers and different styles of their clothing really helps them look more diversive. It's a really nice attention to detail that you don't normally get from a series where the majority of the characters are 50 different colors of the same 3 body styles. There's also the sea pony hippogriffs, and they're actually much more fun to be around than the pirates. Princess Skystar is just adorable. She does come across as another Pinkie Pie, but her characteristics mixed with her different heritage and background all help to give her her own identity. She's bubbly and socially awkward, but she's also a princess, so that may contribute to why she may have a hard time making friends. Probably because her status makes it difficult for others to get close to her. It's also possible that because the hippogriffs were forced underwater that they may be having a hard time adjusting to a new life, which makes it harder for them to socialize with Skystar. I mean, she's been by herself for so long that she's starting to make up imaginary ones from shells. She feels excited and hopeful to see outsiders because she sees it as a new chance to make some friends. But when they say that they have to leave, she feels heartbroken. It's like every time she tries to relate to someone, something ends up happening to take that opportunity away from her. Then Pinkie Pie comes along and she's very enthusiastic over how well she can relate to her, which encourages her to help them after her mother turned them down. The interaction between Pinkie and Skystar is actually a lot of fun as their harmony is quite balanced, not overshadowing each other and playing off each other evenly. Queen Novo, who leads the hippogriffs, is a fairly responsible leader, looking out for her subjects and understanding the difficult decisions that come with leading a kingdom. She has some pretty steady chemistry with her daughter, acting out as a pretty good foil to her optimistic attitude. She's voiced by Uzo Aduba, the voice of Bismuth from Steven Universe, and she does a really nice job lending her voice to this character. It gives an enjoyably sassy touch to her personality without overdoing it, and it blends fairly well with her strong desire to be a productive leader to her people. She does warm up to the group after a while, but her trust is of course broken by Twilight's bad decision. The way she says this is why they don't let strangers in their home emphasizes her lack of trust in others after Tempest and Storm King tried to deceive them. And she really doesn't like how her hospitality was taken advantage of twice. She decides to trust outsiders again after being betrayed by Tempest, only for her trust in outsiders to be broken again immediately after. It's not exactly known what kind of connection there is between Equestria and Mount Eris, so it could be that Novo's actions are more out of a desperation to protect her people and not simply abandoning an ally, which makes her situation easier to empathize with. Finally, you have the villains, Tempest Shadow, Grubber, and the Storm King. And I'm just gonna get this out of the way, Grubber is by far the most annoying and completely pointless character in the film. Like, he really is. Why is he even in the movie at all? He does nothing but tag along Tempest, eat cake, and spew a bunch of catchy phrases painting himself as cool or funny, which he's not. He doesn't do anything to contribute to the story and is just kind of there while Tempest is hunting down Twilight. If you cut him out, literally nothing about the movie would have changed. They obviously included him just for comic relief, but none of his jokes are funny. His delivery and timing are way off, and a lot of the time he's just verbally restating what's happening. What makes this more annoying is that they seem to act like Grubber is an important character because of his relationship with Tempest. There's a line of dialogue that suggests that the two have grown some kind of bond since she joined the Storm King's forces, but that relationship is never explored at any point in the movie. He just follows her around while she does all the work. And during the last third, he completely disappears. He eats some of the Trojan cake, blows their cover, and then we never see him again. It's like they completely forgot all about him near the end of the script, and I can actually understand why. He ends up being such an insignificant element in the movie. What was even the point of hiring Michael Pena for this role if they barely gave him anything to work with? At least Sia sang the song. And you know what really makes Grubber pointless? The fact that we already have a comedic villain in the movie, and a much better one at that. The Storm King, played by Leif Schreiber, is actually a pretty entertaining one-shot villain. He has a lot of energy and has a playfully cynical attitude. He also shows signs of impatience and a short temper, which might explain why some might find him scary. He does feel kind of childish, but he also has a sense of seriousness and intimidation, which adds some charisma to his act. And he just seems to be enjoying himself so much when taking over the Alicorn energy. That scene where he moves around the sun and the moon is so delightful and sinister at the same time. It's like if Discord realized that he could just use his reality warping powers to hold the planet's ecosystem hostage. But despite being a fun villain, the Storm King ultimately feels extremely underdeveloped. And that's because he doesn't have as big of an influence on the story as he should. He's just in this one phone call with Tempest for about a minute, and then he doesn't make an actual appearance until the last 20 minutes of the film. And even then, he's only involved in the movie for about 10 minutes. He's built up as the main antagonist, and he just doesn't do anything noteworthy. He doesn't even interact with any of the characters outside of Tempest, so he isn't even given that much to work with. Aside from that, he ends up falling into a lot of stupid villain tropes leading to his own downfall, such as betraying their loyal sidekicks and not killing the main protagonist when they have the chance. He literally lets Twilight out of her cage for no given reason, simply to give her a chance to make a comeback and save the day. And then he betrays Tempest after she did everything that was asked of her when she was clearly swearing her allegiance to him. Even if he didn't have the ability to restore her horn and was just using her, he could have at least recognized how much it would have benefited him to have Tempest on his side. She captured and defeated all 4 princesses, and even without her magic, she's physically strong and a skilled combatant. If he just resisted the urge to pull off the whole "I got what I wanted so I don't need you anymore" shtick, he might have gotten Tempest to stay at his side, and he would have actually won. I always find myself incredibly annoyed whenever a villain does this, betraying their own allies despite how obviously it's going to bite them in the ass. It's a real shame that the Storm King ends up getting the short stick in this movie because I did read some of the prequel comics, and he gets a lot more justice served to his character in them. In almost all of the prequel issues, the story puts a lot of focus onto the Storm King and takes full advantage of his presence. He's sinister and intimidating, but also has a charming and calm demeanor. He's not exactly friends with his minions, but treats them with proper respect to keep their trust. And in all of his interactions with the citizens he was trying to dominate, as well as his second-in-command Strife, he comes across as both pragmatic and charismatic. He was cunning, threatening, and his motives for control and power felt more fleshed out. If anything, the comics serve as a great introduction to the Storm King's character, which makes it feel even more unfulfilling that he barely does anything in the movie. But now we get to talk about the real villain of the movie, the one character that everyone likes to talk about, for better or worse, Tempest Shadow. From the moment she first appeared in the trailers, we all knew that she meant some serious business, and when the movie came out, she totally lived up to the expectations. Unfortunately, because of her design and antagonistic role, a lot of people have wrongfully labeled her as an emo or edgy OC character, both of which are incorrect interpretations of her character because the story doesn't treat her as such. She was villainous and unfriendly, but that doesn't automatically make her an emo or edgy character. What makes her feel profound as an antagonist is how seriously she takes her position as the Storm King's commander and how she acts as a foil to Twilight. She's a no-nonsense fighter who's very keen and observant, and she does a really good job posing herself as an obstacle for the heroes to work against. Emily Blunt also does a fantastic job acting out the character, making her feel much more intimidating and dangerous. Another thing to take into account is how Tempest seems to be another villain with a tragic backstory who gets redeemed at the end. While it has become formulaic and tiring at this point, Tempest in particular has some reasonable depth to it, making it one of the better ones. A lot of people have also compared her to Starlight Glimmer, which kind of feels petty and unfair, especially when you really take the time to think about where the differences lie. Starlight Glimmer lost one friend because he got his cutie mark and moved away, and she never got over it or tried to contact him, and since then has dedicated her life to getting rid of cutie marks out of spite. Tempest, on the other hand, was attacked, mauled, and dismembered as a child, losing her horn, resulting in her magic becoming unstable and potentially dangerous. Other kids were afraid to play with her because of this unstable magic, so she was never given any emotional support during this hard time. It's possible that she was an orphan since there was no trace of her parents, which would make her social isolation and distrust in others make sense. And all of these things were happening to her while she was a child, a very impressionable part of her life. She might not have been given the counseling or therapy that she needed because the orphanage couldn't afford it. Or maybe if she was receiving it, she was too young to really understand any of the advice that was being given to her. All of this anger and confusion at such a young age could understandably make someone feel close-minded and alone. Tempest's problems weren't something that just manifested out of nowhere like Starlight's did. It was an overview of an ongoing dilemma that was affecting her over time. which gradually ended up impacting her view on the world. Additionally, Tempest wasn't really vengeful like Starlight was. She just believed that she couldn't relate to anyone because of her broken horn. She lost most of her potential, and other unicorns she came across wouldn't have been able to understand what it's like to have that taken away from you. Her wasted on parties line implies her belief that Equestria was being ignorant in how they use their magic, which could be used to help less fortunate creatures. I heard about how some of the prequel book was about Tempest's travels outside of Equestria, and how she was seeing how hard life was outside, because the lands outside seemed povertish and didn't have the means to instantly solve their problems. This could actually factor into her motivation as to why she was so desperate to get her horn back. Unlike Starlight Glimmer, Tempest Shadow, or Fizzlepop Berry Twist, had a stronger level of empathy given to her backstory. It's not all that unique or sophisticated, but it actually feels a lot more interesting when you take the time to think about it. If I did have a problem with Tempest's character, it would have to be about things that happened to her near the end. Her main motto is that the best way to survive is all alone, so with that in mind, why did she ever trust the Storm King to restore her horn? What exactly did he do to prove that he was trustworthy or that he was capable of fixing it? Considering how quickly he backstabs her, there was never anything about his attitude that suggested that he cared about holding up his end of the bargain. So Tempest not only contradicts her own philosophy, but she also looks like an idiot for putting her faith in the Storm King without any good reason to do it. And then you have her completely rushed redemption at the end. Actually, this isn't Tempest's fault as much as it is Twilight's. Her "this is what friends do" line honestly had me laughing at it the more times I saw it. It's such an incredibly stupid thing for Twilight to say, but the movie expects you to take it seriously. She's treating friendship like it's a band-aid to show that Tempest has been forgiven for all her bad decisions, and that's not how friendship works. I could understand Twilight willing to forgive Tempest or wanting to show her mercy, but that friendship line was beyond forced. And at the end of the movie, everyone just forgets that she enslaved an entire city, trapped the princesses in stone, and gave Equestria's strongest power source to a guy who was threatening their ecosystem. The least we could have gotten was a scene where Tempest said that she was sorry or show some form of consequences for her antagonism, but she doesn't get any of that, and she's completely free to join in the rest of the festival. This is actually the one thing that Starlight and Tempest have in common, in which they just get a "as long as you don't threaten our entire existence again" pep talk instead of seeing some form of consequences for their actions. But for what it's worth, I still do like Tempest. She was an interesting antagonist and a good foil to Twilight, and her backstory had more detail to it than you'd probably expect. Maybe if they make another movie and can afford Emily Blunt, they could end up putting her in a supporting role, to show how she's willing to make up for her bad decisions and earn people's trust, like Sunset Shimmer did in the Equestria Girls series. So with all the characters out of the way, what else does the movie have to offer? Well, there's actually quite a lot more to talk about. Some good, some bad, and some that's just kind of in the middle. The exploration theme of the movie is a ton of fun. Because of the tone of the story, a lot of the movie is just about traveling to these lands beyond Equestria, and it's really satisfying to see all of these new lands. It makes the world of Gen 4 feel a lot more detailed and widespread. We also get new creatures and species, which adds more inhabitants to the world, and the introduction of the Hippogriff Kingdom adds new factions to the world as well. There's just so much new content introduced in this movie that it makes the world of Friendship is Magic feel a lot more interesting and alive. And it's just so refreshing that you get to see all of these new landscapes that you don't normally get in the TV series. The new animation style does take some time to get used to, but once you warm up to it, the quality is really impressive. It looks really smooth, and it appropriately fits the higher budget for a theatrical release. Characters are more expressive and the settings look much more three-dimensional. Sometimes it does look a little slow and the characters don't always properly blend into the background, but for the most part, the characters and the settings really seem to blend well together. Even the shading and lighting effects look very superb, making the atmosphere very appealing to look at. They do cram in some unneeded CGI though, and yeah, it does look really awful. This is the kind of CGI that you'd expect from a PS1 game, and it ends up standing out from everything else far too much. It comes across as very distracting when everything else has so much more attention and detail put into to it. Another thing about the animation that just kind of looks off is the eyes on some of the characters. Some of them look too big or too wide, and a lot of them seem to have sparkles in them for some reason. This is something I talked about in my initial review of the movie, and months later, it still feels like a very overly designed aspect of the character models. The comedy is something that's mostly hit and miss. There's plenty of well-timed jokes that connect into the story, which makes them funnier to watch. Some of the movie's funniest moments just come from the clever dialogue that the characters come up with. The line delivery is appropriate, and the situational humor fits with the choice of words very well. Several other jokes, though, either don't have good timing or the delivery on them feels off. And you also have the jokes that are just absolutely terrible. The kind of humor that either relies far too much on the comic relief, or because they need to remind you that this is a movie produced by Hasbro. It's not cringe-inducing bad, but it's still pretty distracting in how obvious the joke is. The songs also have a pretty varying quality to them. First, there's We Got This Together, which mainly focuses on introducing the characters to newcomers and helping Twilight gain her confidence to lead the festival. It's passable enough and does have some good character moments, but it doesn't feel all that necessary. The opening scene from before was already doing a good job introducing the characters, so it feels a little redundant to do it again in musical form. The lyrics are also pretty basic, where they're mostly just saying things like, "Don't worry, Twilight, we're here to help you out." The instrumentals are actually the best part of the song, with several different types of direction based on which characters are singing which verse. It adds a lot of variety to what's otherwise a pretty middle-of-the-road musical number. The Friend You Need, sung by Capper, is unbelievably catchy. It does a really good job introducing you to the character's slippery and tricky personality while immersing you into a false sense of security in an atmosphere riddled with mystery and suspense. The lyrics are fairly creative, and Dig's singing voice has a very luring tone to it, where you know that something just doesn't feel right, but it's so calm and soft that you just feel tranced into following it. He also has a really good range, going from small and smooth to really big and robust in a matter of seconds, and the instrumentals have a mesmerizing feel to them, having this strong tango beat where you just feel the urge to dance along with the characters. If it wasn't for Pinky and Skystar's One Small Thing, this would have been the best song in the movie because it has so much going for it. From the visual style to the tone to Capper's performance, it's a heavily immersing number. Time to Be Awesome is kind of boring, and it's a real shame because the vocal performance of Rainbow Dash and the Pirates is actually pretty good. The main problem with the song is that the melody just feels too generic and the lyrics sound too basic. Another problem with the song is that the atmosphere of it just doesn't feel interesting. Dash sings about restoring their confidence, the Pirates sing about the glory days, and then a sonic rain boom happens. It takes place on this old, dirty pirate ship surrounded by dark clouds, and the environment just feels too gloomy. It doesn't exactly match with the upbeat tone of the song. Out of all the musical numbers, this one just feels the most forgettable. It doesn't have the advantages present in the other songs in the movie, and it just feels like it's wasting Zoe Saldana's talent. But then you have One Small Thing, which is a heck of a lot of fun. Out of all the songs in the movie, this one is by far the most active, most expressive, most visually creative, and most passionately sung. Aside from being incredibly upbeat and optimistic in its tone, the vocal performances are outstanding. The chorus in the background does a great job harmonizing with the main singers as well as the instrumentals, and the main group and Skystar get some very good spotlights in the song. Andrea Libman and Kristen Chenoweth work off each other perfectly. They both have great range, a cheerful singing voice, and a tone that really works off of the orchestra. That one note by Rarity is so beautiful and gorgeous. There's a lot of passion put into it, and it continues to stick with you even as the song keeps playing. Fluttershy, Applejack, and Rainbow Dash get to do some singing too, and they interact with the sea ponies in some charming ways. The visual direction is also incredibly profound. You have all of these vibrant colors mixed with really good lighting effects and all of this free-moving animation. Everyone in this song puts all of their energy into it. They're dancing, expressing themselves, just having a huge blast swimming around and joining in on the fun. And the instrumentals are just amazing. They have a tone that perfectly matches the underwater aspect and this jazzy feeling that just grabs a hold of you and keeps your attention. It keeps building and building up until it finally reaches this grand finale that just explodes in a very energetic finish. This is such a fun musical number and definitely one of the biggest highlights in the movie. Out of all the songs, this one just really spoke to me. With its style, its direction, its performance, and its all-around entertaining beat. After that, you have Open Up Your Eyes, and honestly, I have some pretty mixed feelings on this song. On one hand, the instrumentals have an amazing atmosphere to them, feeling really mysterious and sinister at the same time. The orchestra has this very energetic feel to it with these booming horns and violins that just keep luring you into the dark tone of the song. And of course, Emily Blunt has an incredible singing voice, working off the music and adding momentum to Tempest's presence, making it much more intimidating. However, the lyrics and the setting just don't work very well. It mostly focuses on Tempest slowly circling this cage with a purely crimson aesthetic. It's just too minimal and devoid of variety to be appealing, and the lyrics are just Tempest explaining her cynical outlook and her backstory, which isn't nearly as immersive as Capper's sneakiness or Skystar's rambunctious energy. It feels like they were just going to have Tempest explain her motives normally, but then they decided to turn it into a musical number to make it more exciting, and it just doesn't work the way that they wanted it to. This song still has some good qualities to it, but it's ultimately not as catchy as some of the other ones. Finally, there's Rainbow, sung by Sia. I said most of what I thought of this song in my previous review, but I still feel like this one has some nice stuff going for it. It has an enjoyably gentle tone throughout, and it has some very nice visual accompaniment, with some nice color mixing and a pointy non-outline cutout style. The lyrics are very average, but I think what really makes this song is Sia herself. She just has a fantastic singing voice, very elegant and encouraging. It has some kind of triumphant feel to it that makes her music sound very well done. She also sang Unforgettable for Finding Dory the previous year, and that was a pretty good song too. There's something about Sia's singing that has this really majestic and comforting reach to it, and I think that's personalized pretty well in Rainbow. It's a nice closing song, and it works pretty well with the animation during the credits. So with all that said, what's left to talk about? Well, there is one thing left, and unfortunately, it's the movie's biggest flaw. The story. Now, I don't exactly mean the writing, I mean that the flow of the movie itself feels really out of place. For starters, the pacing during the first half is way too fast. Within those 45 minutes, we go from a festival to an attack on Canterlot to traveling through a desert to traveling through a sand village to being chased onto a pirate ship to escaping the pirate ship and finally reaching Mount Eris. The movie goes through a whole bunch of events in what seems like a small amount of time, and the story doesn't really slow down enough in order for them to be leveled out. Because of this fast pacing, we don't really get enough time to develop the villain or even the lesser side characters. Capper and Tempest are the only ones who get any legitimate focus up to that point, and in between we have a boring band of pirates, an underutilized villain, and an annoying comic relief. Aside from that, the fast pacing during the first half just keeps forcing the story to keep going by any means necessary, and it ends up creating several confusing plot points. First off, the main group manages to get to the sand village on foot in as little as 1 day, a trip that would normally take a couple of days by train. The Storm King specifically told Tempest that she needed to find them in 3 days. I seriously doubt the group got that far in just 2.5. This might not have been so bad if they only ended up doing it once, but then they somehow pull this off again during the second half. After Capper and the pirates and Skystar join the group, they managed to make a trip that Tempest had to make on an airship, on foot, in almost the following scene. The film is acting like they were right behind Tempest, but they couldn't have been because they were still stuck on that island. Did they just have some kind of fast travel that was never shown or explained on screen? It literally makes no sense. Another problem with the movie is that it kind of feels formulaic, and not because it has cliches. It ends up being formulaic within its own self-contained environment. Remember how the first 45 minutes were rushed because they had to cram a lot of events in the first half of the movie? Well, the movie ends up going through a lot of familiar terrain because of that. Each time the group travels somewhere, they kind of end up doing the same thing. They show up, they make a friend, then something bad happens and they're forced into the next setting. It becomes easier to notice upon more viewings, and it makes the events of the story not as exciting as they should be. The movie also ends up suffering from some annoyances that are unfortunately carried over from the show. For example, the princesses are immediately defeated and rendered useless, which adds to the stereotype that they're completely incompetent leaders who can't defend their kingdom. In this instance, they don't even do anything to fight back. Cadence was barely able to use a shield, which just ends up being useless anyway, and Celestia just gives up and tries to seek help from the Hippogriffs. Then Luna ends up turning her back on her attacker, leaving her vulnerable. She could have at least turned her head to look for any oncoming attacks and dodged them. The princesses being rendered useless is something that's gotten completely tiring over the years, and it's really not any better when this movie does it. Another thing that people have brought up is how some key characters are missing. Shining Armor is completely absent during this turn of events, or he doesn't know that his wife has been turned to stone. Maybe he stayed behind to look after the Crystal Empire, but the movie doesn't do anything to acknowledge his existence. Also, at this point the main group is allied with Discord, who could have easily solved everything with the flick of his wrist. People have said that leaving him out was necessary since his presence would have confused newcomers or prevented the conflict from working, but he was still made into a supporting character. They don't come up with some kind of reason or explanation as to why they can't use Discord, because just like Shining Armor, the movie acts like he doesn't exist. But they must know about him since there was a balloon of him in the beginning. That is just incredibly contrived. But even without that, the events of the second half end up making the adventure feel pointless. The whole reason the group left to Mount Eris was to seek help from the Hippogriffs, but they end up playing no role in the final battle. The movie treats them like they were a key element in the story, like they were gonna come back and help fight the Storm Army in the climax. But Skystar is the only one who does anything, which makes their presence in the movie feel very underwhelming. And from what I've heard, the Hippogriffs were originally meant to help out in the final battle. Apparently this idea was cut to focus on the main group, but this was a terrible decision. They spend so much time building them up, and then they don't use them, making the adventure feel hollow and not very fulfilling. And it makes the final battle feel incredibly underwhelming. The new characters only bring some extra muscle to the final battle, and even then, it doesn't feel like enough. The Storm Army had completely conquered all of Canterlot in a few hours, but then they're easily defeated by a small group of misfits. That just feels very impractical. Because of the setting of the fight and how it's built up, it feels like the Hippogriffs were supposed to come back. And they should have come back. It would have solved a lot of issues with the story, and it would have made for a much more exciting final battle. How did the Storm King ever conquer anything if his army can easily be outmatched by a small group of outcasts? It's just so stupid to think that his forces were so powerful, but then they're easily being thwarted in 5 minutes by a small group. One other thing that people have brought up is how so much of the story doesn't make sense because it takes place between season 7 and 8, and the movie ends up disregarding a lot of elements from the show. But while I can understand why people would criticize the movie for that, it's not exactly the movie's fault. Plans for a movie were originally announced back in 2014, sometime after season 4 ended, and Megan McCarthy, who hasn't really worked on the show since the end of season 4, was the main writer behind this movie. So in hindsight, the events of the movie were made with only the first 4 seasons in mind, so it was basically meant to take place between season 4 and season 5. The reason I bring this up is because it would make a ton of sense for the movie to take place between 4 and 5. At this point, they weren't allied with the Dragons and Changelings, and Flurryheart wasn't even born yet. And considering how the group was cautious around Discord at some points in seasons 4 and 5, it might explain why they didn't trust him to fight the Storm King. With the background history of the movie in mind, it is possible to see it as something that happened between seasons 4 and 5 instead of 7 and 8. All except for one notable issue. Starlight and Trixie are in the movie as cameos, and their friendship was something that ended up happening in season 6. What makes it even worse is that it's a completely pointless cameo for them to make. Neither of them have a speaking role, which further implies how the story was meant to happen between seasons 4 and 5. I know they like to use cameos to get extra brownie points from the fandom, but this was not worth it. Because of this cameo, it becomes very hard to think of this as something that happened between seasons 4 and 5. It's a small detail that greatly throws off the narrative you're going for. I know that the movie is trying to be more self-contained and not too involved with the show, but it doesn't work like that because the movie was meant for fans of the show. There seems to be this meant for fans of the show versus introducing newcomers theme in the movie, and it's admittedly very confusing and hard to get around. It'll end up confusing newcomers because they don't know anything about the show, and it could end up confusing fans of the series because of all the content that isn't addressed from seasons 5 through 7. It can end up turning off people from both sides no matter what. The movie honestly would have been better off if it wasn't so concerned with entertaining newcomers. We already knew that the movie was only going to be truly seen by fans of the show, so it's very unlikely that it's going to appeal to anyone outside of the Brony fandom. However, that's not really my biggest problem with the movie. My biggest problem with the movie is unfortunately what normally ends up happening to a movie based on a TV show. And that problem is that it just ends up feeling like an extended episode of the show. And the main reason why it feels like an extended episode is because nothing special or extraordinary happens. It's not like the Powerpuff Girls where the movie covered their origin story or SpongeBob SquarePants was presenting itself as the series finale. The MLP movie feels like an extended episode of the show because it actually kind of is an extended episode of the show. The story of the movie is basically your usual two-parter season finale stretched out for 90 minutes. The girls are having a normal day and then some kind of evil attacks them and the princesses are deemed useless and the main group has to travel somewhere to solve the problem. A new friend is made, they confront the villain in a final battle, and everything goes back to normal. There's really nothing special about the movie that makes it special compared to the show, and it makes the film feel less creative as a result. I think a much better idea for the movie would have had something involving ancient equestrian civilization, exploring alicorn lore, or some kind of supernatural phenomenon that's affecting all of Equestria at one time. Something really grand and epic in scale to really separate itself from the standards set by the show. But I guess they just couldn't think of anything, and what we ended up getting was your basic two-parter made into a movie. And it just doesn't have as much lasting power as it could have. So yeah, there was a lot of stuff in the movie that didn't work out, and it does make the movie feel less impressive upon multiple viewings. But does that really make the movie bad? Well, not exactly. In fact, it's still a reasonably passable project. They wanted to do something to bring MLP to the big screen, and for the most part it paid off. It has good songs, good characters, and some really good artwork. However, you also have a couple of bad characters, some really bad story decisions, and some uninteresting songs alongside the good ones. But again, the movie does have several good qualities to it, so it's not like that you would be missing anything if you skip it. I do still recommend it to anyone who hasn't seen it. I still think we could have gotten something a lot better, but I think what we ended up getting in the end was serviceable enough. If you haven't seen it yet and have some spare time, check it out. You just might find something that'll keep you entertained. This is Map, signing out.